It's Authors Revealed, and I'm Becky Anderson. I'm so thrilled. We have English author Kate Moore with one of the best pieces of nonfiction out this year. It's called The Radium Girls. It's all about the girls and the women who painted with radium on the dials of clocks in 1917 through the 1920s. Kate, it's so wonderful to have you back in Naperville and here in the store.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is a pleasure because this book is absolutely phenomenal. And I thought it was so brilliant the way you told this story. You know, I kind of know a little bit about it, but you know, but having to hear the story from the women directly.
Yeah.
And that's what made this book so brilliant to me.
Thank you.
To hear this whole story of Radium Girls. But I just want to know, what are you hearing from readers? Because I know the book was out in the UK earlier,
yes,
from another publisher, but we're so proud that you've published with Source Books, which we are so proud of, to have a national recognized publisher right here in Naperville to publish this book.
Yeah, well, I mean, Source Books was so important to me when I was choosing which American publisher to go with, because the local connection. This is partly an Illinois story, you know, where we're sitting right here in Naperville. You know, Ottawa, Illinois is only 50 odd miles away.
So from Ottawa, where a lot of this takes place.
Exactly.
And you know, I had relatives that lived in Ottawa, and even a grand aunt who lived in Princeton, Illinois, but worked for West Clock, and then also
worked this is local history in action.
So it's fabulous. But where did, you know, when you're thinking about readers and your readers in the UK, and knowing this is an American story, what were the reactions of readers there, and what are you hearing now that the book is almost out a month here in the US?
Well, very similar reactions, I would say, because I think above all, and certainly the way I approached it, was that this was a human story. This is about, just as you said, the individual women who are the Radium Girls. And it's about their personal journeys and their personal experiences. And that is an international sensation. So even though it's an American story, everyone can identify with a sister, with a mother, and the experiences these women went through, you know, battling for their rights, facing the personal tragedy of facing a demise of a mother, knowing that your children are going to have to grow up without you. And that crosses borders. And the reaction from readers has primarily, I would say, been two things: reacting to the women's story, recognising their courage and their bravery, and also the heartache of the story. But secondly, a kind of shock that they didn't know this story. And that has what has been wonderful for me, both here in America and in the UK, is bringing recognition to these incredible women whose individual experiences had kind of been lost in the mists of time.
So I want to know, where did the idea, the little seed, come from this? Because there's an interesting story that got you into writing this book about the Radium Girls.
Absolutely. So obviously I'm British, I'm from London, and I discovered this American story through a play, These Shining Lives by Melanie Marnich. And because I was directing a production based on real events, I felt this responsibility to do justice to the women. And so I wanted my production to be as authentic as it could be. So I did as much research as I could as a director. So I read the other books that exist on them, which are fantastic. Radium Girls by Claudia Clark and Deadly Glow by Dr. Ross Molnar. And as wonderful as those books are, neither of them actually focuses on the girls. And so as I was reading this research and falling in love with the women through directing the play about them, I was like, why isn't there a book that exists that follows the Radium Girls story? Because this is their story. The other books are about the incredible legal legacy that they've left, or about the unique health conditions that resulted from this, you know, never before seen kind of poisoning that had never existed in human beings before. But I thought the women, the Radium Girls, deserved their own book that told their stories. And I thought, if no one else has done it, why don't I?
So I guess what's so brilliant about it is that narrative that you write from their story. And you know, I always say that true stories are something even more fantastical than any fiction you can write. And that's what made this one so unbelievable, because it was so personal. And their stories made you connect with just maybe some of the other books that have been written about that were a little bit more dry history.
Yeah, as I say, for me, I wanted to bring those individual women to life. Catherine Donahue, Peg Looney, you know, all these women that I write about in the book. And I wanted to walk in step with them. And my research, you know, it literally took me to Ottawa, Illinois, and I stood outside Catherine's house on East Superior Street, and I traced what would have been her commute to walk. You know, it's only a 7-minute walk to the Radium studio. But that's what the book hopefully brings to life, is that readers too can walk in step with these women as they embark on this incredible experience, horrifying experience, but also one that I think is also inspirational for readers.
And I know there's a memorial in Ottawa, isn't there?
There is, on the corners of Clinton and Jefferson.
Right.
There's a statue for the girls.
So the play, having directed the play, and having researched, even just to get more in depth into your characters into the play as a director. But did that really inform your writing then of the book? And I know you did a lot more research for the book.
Yes.
But having it on stage for people to perform, and having these girls and these women as some of the characters you were directing.
I think it did inform it necessarily, because I'd got to know the women originally through that play script. And so I think therefore they were already real to me in a way that perhaps if I'd only encountered the story through the books first, they wouldn't have been. And I think as well, because I'd already told the story as a director on stage, I kind of brought a sense of drama to the way I wrote the non-fiction book as well. And if you read it, it's written in the style of the novel. It has, you know, hopefully page-turning moments and kind of, you know, gripping chapter endings with cliffhangers to make you read on. And I think that sense of drama, which I brought to the story on stage, also then translates to the book as well.
And it's a lot of that anger, that how can people be so incredibly immoral to take advantage of such young women.
Readers have commented on how that comes through in the writing.
For sure, for sure. So you were here a couple of months ago and did a pre-publication event.
I did,
and there were a lot of high school students there.
It was just wonderful to meet them, And what was wonderful was that the story really seemed to resonate with them. You know, these were young women, young men who were at your local high school, I believe they were coming from. And they really connected with the story because, of course, the Radium Girls were mostly teenagers when they're starting work. So these women that I'm writing about were exactly the same age as these high school students. And they were very sweet. You very kindly organised for me a copy of the book that the children signed, that the students signed for me. And they said wonderful things. They said things like, this is the first non-fiction book I haven't fallen asleep to. And that means, I know, that means so much to me that, you know, I hope I wrote it, as I say, in this novelistic way, which I wanted to be accessible, because as amazing as the other books are, they're obviously, you know, they started life as dissertations and so on, they're quite academic, they're quite dry. And I wanted my version of the women's story to be accessible for anyone. And it was wonderful to meet those high school students and realise that for that group at least, I had achieved that aim, that anyone can pick up this book and enjoy it and go on that journey with the women.
And they could totally relate, because some of them were exactly their age when they started working there.
There's a real parallel.
So you really introduce well where radium came from in the book, and tell us its discovery and the different uses. And they thought it was a health benefit, or in many things, and it was in food, it was in so many things. So tell us a little bit about that. It was a very expensive material.
It was. So I mean, it's really hard for us to kind of appreciate now from this kind of modern mentality, looking back with hindsight. So radium was discovered in December 1898 by the Curies, and very quickly, you know, the book opens with a prologue dated in 1901, you know, decades before the Radium Girls started painting in 1917 in New Jersey and 1922 here in Illinois. And in that 1901 prologue, it begins with a scientist getting hurt by radium. He gets a radiation burn. And because the scientists realised that radium could be dangerous, they started to, you know, it could destroy human tissue. They directed it at cancerous tumours. And very quickly, radium became known that it could help to treat cancer. therefore people saw it as this miraculous life-saving element. And what happened was the radium firms who were making their money out of radium, and as you say, it was very expensive because it was so difficult to extract from its source. A single gram in today's values would cost you $2.2 million for a single gram. And these radium firms did research because they thought, okay, a large amount will destroy human tissue, but it can treat cancer. What would it happen if we only used a small amount? And the research they funded, to their mind, showed that a small amount was beneficial. So you're right, what then happened was that radium was seen as this wonder element, and people took it not only to cure a whole range of ailments, everything from hay fever to impotence, but people also saw it as a kind of elixir of youth, and they took it all in the same way that today we would take vitamins. So people were drinking radium water. The mayor of Chicago was a fan of this. People were drinking radium water, and the recommended dose was 5 to 7 glasses a day.
Oh my gosh.
And it was in everything: cosmetics, food, chocolate,
toothpaste, lingerie.
It was everything.
Crazy applications.
And, you know, and people were singing about it on Broadway. It was, it was everywhere. It was a cultural phenomenon, and it was international as well. It happened in England, it happened in France, in Germany. It was all over the world.
Yeah. So it was like this cure-all for so many things.
So the Radium Girls thought they were so lucky to work with it.
To work with that.
Yeah.
So tell us about how the United States Radium Corporation started, and why the application to put it onto watch dials, and also then going into, you talk about 1917 in New Jersey, but how moving into World War I, and how the application and why these girls were trained to dip. You can tell us all about that.
Okay, so radium, as we know, is radioactive. So that's why it was having all these health benefits. What the other kind of key thing about it is that it is luminous, it glows. Marie Curie wrote about how she was enchanted by the glow of the radium. And the founder of the United States Radium Corporation, Sabin von Sochotsky, he decided to put that glowing element into a kind of paint. And actually, even before he started his company, it was used by Tiffany's in New York. The vice president there painted it onto jewellery and described it as cold light. And obviously what happened was you've got this glow-in-the-dark paint. And so they started applying it to clocks and watches, because if you think of a clock on your bedside table in the middle of the night, if it's got glowing numbers on, you know, that's a great thing. And the impact that World War I had was that the dial painters weren't just painting watches and clocks, they were painting aeronautical instruments. So if you think of a plane or a ship or a truck, you've got that whole dashboard of glowing instruments, and it was the Radium Girls who were painting them. So with America joining the First World War, it led to this enormous boom in the radium industry, and they needed hundreds of women to fulfill that demand.
Right. And the thing is, they were taking, the brushes were made from, was it camel hair? Camel hair.
Yes.
And dipping it into a solution, but they couldn't paint as well with pens, so they started to dip these brushes.
That's it. It's a technique called lip pointing.
Right.
And what the women would do, as you say, they dip the brush into the powder and into the paint, and then they put it between their lips, and they'd almost suck the brush, kind of use their teeth almost to kind of thin the bristles, so that when you're painting those tiny numbers on watches, they had that delicate point on the brush. And apparently the technique came from the China painting factories, where women used to paint with watercolours, where it wasn't harmful necessarily to put your brush in your lips, but they just moved the technique over to the radium industry, not knowing of the dangers. And in fact, May Cubberley, who is one of the New Jersey girls, she said the first thing we asked was, does this stuff hurt you? So the Radium Girls weren't naive about it. They did ask their managers, but the managers believed the research that the firms had funded that said radium was fine. So they were assured that there was no problem and that it wasn't dangerous.
Incredible, incredible.
Yeah.
So, you know, so women's rights were pretty much trampled on in these things.
Yes.
And there was a difference, you talk about in the book, between some of the male technicians and what they did, and what these young women is, and you say as young as 11 years old.
Some of them, that's what records show.
Doing this work. So there was prejudice against being a female and being young.
Absolutely. So what was happening, as I say, because they knew radium was dangerous, that was established at the turn of the century. the men who were working in the labs, who were handling these large amounts of radium, were wearing lead aprons. They weren't allowed to touch the radium. They wielded ivory-tipped tongs, whereas the women, and this is literally on the same site, you know, in one building they've got protective gear on, and in the studio next door the girls are putting their radium-laden brushes into their mouths.
Yeah.
So there was a real dichotomy about it.
Yeah. So all these young women, tell us about their backgrounds, where they came from, because I know both in New Jersey at the 2 different plants and then here in Illinois and Ottawa. What kind of young women were these? I mean, what were their backgrounds? You know, what type of families did they come from?
Yeah, a lot of them tended to be the daughters or granddaughters of immigrants, you know, families who had come to America in search of a better life and better opportunities. Yeah. They tended to be poor and working class, and they were therefore attracted to the job of dial painting because it was an incredibly lucrative profession. So dial painters were in the top 5% of female wage earners nationally. So these girls in this time of female empowerment, you know, obviously just getting the female vote, and, you know, the roaring 20s are beginning to happen. And so, you know, these women are sometimes earning more than their husbands and fathers as they're dial painting. Yeah. And they also, the other thing that's important to say, so we've mentioned how young they were. The other thing to say about them is that because the job was seen as so lucrative and glamorous because they would glow with the paint as well, they encouraged their friends and their sisters and their cousins to join them. So you ended up with whole sets of siblings dial painting away in the studios. So I think for me, it's part of the tragedy and part of the important thing to say about who they were. Often they were family members.
Right, so it's devastating for an entire family.
Exactly,
yeah. So I know the research that you did when you were directing the play.
Yes.
But then when you wrote the book, and I know I've talked to so many authors about who write nonfiction or even some fiction, that the research, sometimes you get so involved in it that you go down the proverbial rabbit hole, right?
Yes, yeah.
So was that your case? Because I know you found some incredible stuff.
I did,
and you know, looking at primary source materials, whether it was letters or court documents. But tell us a little bit about some of those really interesting things that you might have been one of the first people to really access these things.
Well, I had this extraordinary experience in the LaSalle County Historical Museum out in Utica in Illinois, where I'd heard on the grapevine that they had some Radium Girls material. And I went and I asked the woman in charge, you know, can you show me your Radium Girls material? And she took me to a cabinet and there was a single picture of the women and Claudia Clark's book. And I said, I'm sure there's some other things. And she says, no, don't know anything about anything more. And she finally asked her manager for me and he said, we've got a folder in the back office, you can have a look. And this was an extraordinary experience for me because what happened when I got that folder off the, you know, this shelf in a back office in this small museum, and I started leafing through it, was that there were actually letters from the Radium Girls between each other and their own accounts of their illness. And that was remarkable because, as I say, these were in the back office, and wonderfully they're now doing an exhibit where members of the public can go and see those letters. Right. But at the time I was researching, as I say, they were tucked out of the way, they weren't shown, and there was very much a feeling that no one had looked at these letters in a very long time. Yeah. And it really did feel like the girls were kind of speaking to me through the years. And that was the same with other, you know, as you say, the court records and so on that I found. You know, here were their voices. They'd been there all along, but it was almost like no one had been listening until now. And it's been wonderful to be able to quote those letters and diaries and court testimonies so that my Radium Girls book is the girls' story, and it gives them a platform, and it is a forum for those voices to speak out after 100 years of silence.
Yeah, for sure.
They're there and they're talking.
Yeah, it's just not a history, it's your actual words. Which
exactly,
makes it so,
exactly.
So
I feel very much that I'm almost their kind of conduit or a representative. You know, yes, my name's on the cover, but so is theirs, and this is their story.
Yeah. And you know, the women you talk about and their families, but like Catherine Donahue and Quinta McDonald, and then you start off the book with Catherine Schaub.
Yes.
You know, and these women, and I know you did some talking to some of their descendants.
Yes.
And you know, you talk in the book how hard it was for husbands and children and everything. But what did you find out by talking to their families directly, their descendants?
Oh, they were just able to describe to me what these women were really like, and I was so interested in that. I wanted to know every detail. Sure. I wanted to know what their homes smelt like. I wanted to know what the women liked to cook or liked to wear or what their hobbies were. And of course the families were able to tell me that. And I think perhaps one of the most moving interviews for me was talking to the niece of Catherine Donahue. And she was about 13 when her aunt was sick. And she was able to describe for me, and in such a evocative way, to take me inside Catherine's sick room. And that for me was the most extraordinary experience, because she described how Catherine was too sick at that stage to be able to sleep upstairs in the bedroom. So they brought her wrought iron bedstead downstairs to the front room. And she talked of how Catherine liked to have the shades drawn, so it was a darkened room.
Right.
And I remember asking her, because I was trying to obviously understand what it was really like to be in that room. It smells, it sounds.
Yeah.
And I said, did Catherine ever cry out with the pain? And Mary said she didn't have the energy to scream. All she could do was moan. She was just moaning, moaning. And for her to tell me that, and for me to be able to describe what it's like to be a radium girl, and that was just extraordinary, so insightful.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the symptoms and when they would appear, and those, there's different varying degrees, but and people reacted differently. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the thing about radium poisoning is it's very insidious. It takes years to show itself. And that was part of the problem the girls had when they were trying to say to the companies, you're at fault here, you've hurt us. And of course the companies were denying it flat out. Part of the problem they had was that we're kind of 5 years, if not longer, on from when the women were dial painting. Right. And so what would happen was it would start quite innocently. It might be a loose tooth or an aching limb. And the women would go to the dentist and he would pull the tooth. But then the next tooth would start hurting, and then the next one. And eventually the women didn't have to go to the dentist anymore because their teeth would fall out. And what was happening was the radium was settling into their bones. Radium is a bone seeker, a bit like calcium. Yeah. And in the same way that we drink a glass of milk because calcium will go into our bones to make them strong, radium goes into our bones. But in the women, it was destroying them. So it was destroying the teeth, but it was also destroying their jaw bones. And that aching limb, the leg or an arm, sometimes even their spine or a hip, the radium would settle anywhere in the women. It seemed to almost do it on a whim. And it was essentially destroying those bones. And when doctors studied the bones afterwards, they found they were honeycombed and moth-eaten. They had holes in them. And these women were alive when this was happening. The radium was drilling holes into their bones. And I therefore think that their extraordinary courage in fighting for justice when suffering in this excruciating way just makes what they achieved even more remarkable.
Right, and allowing themselves to be studied.
Yes.
To know what the effects
are. You know, we're talking here in Illinois. I'm sure many of your viewers will know the Argonne National Laboratory, where the Centre for Human Radiobiology was centred, this multi-million-pound laboratory where the girls were studied. You know, those whose radium poisoning hadn't yet kicked in, because, as I say, sometimes it would take decades to show itself. They voluntarily went and were studied. They had bone marrow biopsies, they had x-rays, they had invasive kind of both mental health and physical health questionnaires that they fulfilled. Many of the radium girls donated their bodies to science to be studied. And they also exhumed the girls that had been killed and tested them. And so the Radium Girls didn't just leave us a legacy of workers' rights and, you know, legislative protection for workers. They also left us a scientific legacy. And scientists have said it's invaluable. All we know about internal radiation comes from the Radium Girls.
I mean, it's so incredible to think what they're suffering and this horrific tragedy that's happened to them, but yet they're thinking of the future and what they can do to help someone.
Yeah, it was a gift to humanity. And I think what's really remarkable about their courage and bravery and what they did in you know, in the face of communities shunning them, in the face of the corporations trying to discredit them, they were not thinking, as you say, they were thinking of others, because they knew that radium poisoning was fatal. There was no hope for them. They weren't battling selfishly. They were battling for others. And Grace Fryer, I think, perhaps summed it up best, who was one of the New Jersey girls. And she said when she took her company to court, she said, "It is not for myself that I am thinking, but for the hundreds of other girls to whom this may serve as an example." And I think I think, funnily enough, here we are talking 100 years on,
Yeah, right.
and Grace's actions and those of Catherine Donahue and the other women in Illinois don't just serve as an example to the other Radium Girls,
Right.
they serve as an example to all of us.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And I hope that, readers reading it will think these
yeah.
women were inspirational, and if these young, poor, working class women, can stand up for themselves and they can fight for justice, then anyone, no matter how small you are, no matter how powerless you feel, you can also make a difference.
Yeah, you can make a difference.
Yeah.
And in face of a corporation considering you disposable.
Exactly.
And lying to
Yes.
you and knowing that this is a danger.
Yeah.
But then even in court lying. And then
Yeah.
people even denying some of this into the 1970s, which is just
I know.
incomprehensible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, that just shows how deep the kind of obstruction and the kind of opposition to what the
Right.
women were doing ran. I found questionnaires filled in by people that the women used to work with, and as you say, they were filled in the 1970s, decades after the women
Yeah.
had died. These were, in the Argonne files that I read at the National Archives in Chicago. And these people were saying, who worked with the women, they said, I don't think a single girl died of radium poisoning. Those that they said looked terrible from the radium poisoning looked terrible when they started.
Unbelievable.
He still wouldn't believe it, even though it was medically proven, even though everyone accepted it.
Yeah. But that is just unbelievable. So tell us a little about the Manhattan Project. The Radium Girls and what happened helped, people protect people at the Manhattan
They did.
Project.
So what the Radium Girls had done in standing up for themselves in fighting for justice, these landmark legal cases became internationally famous. They were front page news across America and across the world. And Glenn Seaborg, who was a leading scientist on the Manhattan Project, he obviously had read all the papers and he knew what had happened to the Radium Girls.
Yeah.
And because of that, he wrote in his diary that as he was walking through the Manhattan Project laboratories one night, he had a vision of the ghost girls, of the Radium Girls.
Right.
And he suddenly thought, obviously they were using radioactive materials on the Manhattan Project. And he thought, I wonder if what we're dealing with might have a similar impact that the radium these
Sure,
women
yeah.
used. And therefore he insisted that they did research on the plutonium, and it was found to be biomedically similar to radium. And if he hadn't done that, and of course once they realised it would have the same
Sure.
effect, it would settle in the workers' bones, it would destroy those bones and so on, he insisted that safety standards be put in place to protect the Manhattan Project workers.
Right.
And therefore the Radium Girls saved
and
all those
continue to save
thousands.
people
Exactly, because
from-
they
yes.
then, of course, put safety
Right,
standards in place for
right.
all radioactive industries. So
Being a writer, and I know you write in a lot of different genres.
I do, yeah. Yeah.
And which I think is absolutely incredible. But do you remember your earliest recollection as a child, maybe wanting to be a writer? Do you remember how old you were, or anything that you maybe wrote when you were really young?
I mean, I've always written. I've always written. My mum has still kind of got little scraps of stories and things like that. And I think I always used to write long things. I can remember I'd always start stories and not finish them. And of course, what's nice in a way about non-fiction is you do have an ending. And so obviously now I am a professional writer. I do actually finish my books. So that's the difference. But yeah, from a young age, I can't remember my
That's
first
wonderful.
recollection.
So I was wondering, this would make just a incredible documentary. Is there any thought of doing that, and everything you've put together and found out about so many of these young women, it'd be an incredible documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that there will be some kind of movie form, because I think the women deserve
for sure.
it. And obviously a film has a much, it's got a different reach than a book.
Yeah.
So watch this space, I guess. Hopefully something might happen.
Okay. And what are you working on now? Anything that you're working on?
Yes, I've been very busy since I wrote The Radium Girls. So I had a book that came out in February, which was about a cat called Felix the Railway Cat, another non-fiction story.
Right.
And
a nice change.
Yeah. It was all
Right.
kind of heartwarming stories of the cat's life. It was a Sunday Times bestseller, so
Wonderful.
that was wonderful.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I'm really excited about is a project that I ghost wrote with Stephen Fulcher, who is a policeman. And the book is called Catching a Serial Killer. and it's out in June.
So Kate, thank you so much, and congratulations on the Radium Girls. Everyone needs to read it.
Thank
Great
you.
for book groups. But thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you.
Fascinating conversation with English author Kate Moore about her new book, The Radium Girls. You absolutely have to read this. Thanks for joining me on Authors Revealed.